In 1798, Robert Malthus famously predicted that unchecked population growth would drive down the standard of living and potentially lead to mass starvation. Well, we all know that was wrong, because here we are. But he was nearly right. Several times the human race stared disaster in the face. How did we feed the world? And does it mean that we can now simply dismiss the modern Malthusians who predict that millions will starve in the future? In nature, carrying capacity is a thing. Animals have certain resource requirements and those don't change very much. So if the size of a population outstrips the ability of its local environment to provide for it, then they either have to move, if they can, or they die out. You might be used to thinking that such dynamics don't really apply to the human race, but they certainly used to. For a significant part of our history, we were hunter-gatherers, and there's plenty of evidence that we were very susceptible. Luckily, humans were very mobile and very adaptable as well, so quite often the limitations of a local environment led to the population spreading further and faster across the face of the earth. That dynamic led to the efficient spread of a species, but it also meant that the population density that was possible in the hunter-gatherer world was extremely low compared to today. It was the move to agriculture that first made modern life possible, because it enabled us to generate surpluses that could be used in trade and to support people carrying out other functions than growing food. In other words, it enabled people to specialise, not just to be fully occupied in subsistence survival. Even then, the supportive nature of the environment constrained what we could do. The first tentative steps towards farming were made by the Malthusian culture around 15,000 years ago. They lived in settlements around what is Jericho today, and they started the deliberate cultivation of certain cereal crops. But just as they were making the breakthrough, it all changed and they regressed back to hunter-gathering. Why? Probably because of climate change. The onset of the Younger Dryas period made regular rainfall and summer weather suitable for ripening crops very unreliable. There was no genetic domestication of crops at that time, so you were tied to whatever the local natural grains would deal with. There's a semi-spoiler in there for you for later. Now, eventually the climate switched back, and we entered a period of more reliable weather, and once the conditions were right, farming was invented separately in at least 6 other places, more or less at the same time. And although this progressed over the centuries, various human civilizations were enabled by it and thrived and then subsequently failed, we were always close to the edge of what we could get the land to support. Famine was never that far away. People had little idea about soil fertility, so they would try to coax crops out of ground that became more and more stripped of nutrients. In good times, the harvests would be just about okay, they'd be reasonable. The numbers in people in cities would increase because they could be supported, and then you would hit a period of poorer climate, and suddenly farmers were feeding themselves only, and the brutal logic of scarcity would bring down the populations again. Even up to relatively recently. So in the much talked about medieval warm period, England thrived. Crops grew, the nation's sheep flock expanded to around 10 million animals, 2 for every person, and the population boomed as well. Now eventually the growing population began to hit Malthusian limits. Not initially that they outstripped food supply, but they outstripped the ability of the economy to support them. So rents became inflated because there were more people chasing fewer properties. Wages, on the other hand, deflated because there were plenty of people chasing jobs. So the basic law of supply and demand made them cheap. By 1315, wages had halved over the course of a century. And that left you with a system supported by a benign, stable climate that was nevertheless under significant stress. Then came the terrible summers of 1315, 1317, which slashed the yields of wheat crops across northern Europe. And that was just the start. Poor harvests and cold winters became the norm, not the exception. The population stagnated under those harsher conditions, many dying early because of starvation or deprivation. And then, of course, the Black Death arrived and ploughed through the weakened population in dramatic fashion. followed by more bad harvests, a second round of plague. By 1450, the population of England was basically the same as it had been back in 1200, and even though plague had been a part of that, you could have made the argument that it had reached a level it was hard to grow beyond with the resources that they had at their disposal. Population growth was only ever sluggish, and then regular disease kept it pegged back. So it basically stayed at the same levels right up until the advent of the Industrial Revolution. And as the growth was starting to become evident then, that's when Malthus made his predictions. It might be that the downward pressure on populations had some unforeseen beneficial side effects. In Europe, the scarcity of people meant that rents went back down, wages went back up, which meant more people could afford some of the basic luxuries, and they had incentives to find tools and technologies that could produce more food and other products with less labour. In contrast, Japan didn't see the Black Death and saw its population continuing to grow with a type of agriculture based on paddy rice, because that thrived without the need for lots of fertilizer. And because people became so plentiful, labour became extremely cheap, and it meant farmers there gave up the plough in favour of the handheld hoe because people were cheaper to employ than were farm animals. It meant that for 100 years you had a country whose technology stagnated. Because the environment naturally supported more people, it stymied the need for innovation. But while Japan had the luxury of largely self-fertilising crops, that wasn't the case in Europe. When Malthus wrote, Europe was starting to be sustained by significant grain imports from America. The settling of new land in the US helped for a while, but then those lands started to become depleted as well, and it looked as though Malthus was inevitably going to be proven right. In the 1830s, there was a lucky find that fended off the problem for a while in the form of dry bird islands that were discovered with huge quantities of guano. For the next 40 years, this provided a significant source of fertilizer for European agriculture that enabled the yields to continue growing. Unsurprisingly, the birds were not able to keep up with that sort of demand, and soon the deposits of guano were exhausted. By the turn of the 20th century, there was a fertilizer crisis for sure. We were about to hit a hard barrier to human growth, even as the population numbers were really starting to take off. Indeed, Sir William Crookes returned to Malthus's theme exactly 100 years after the original, saying this: "All civilizations stand in deadly peril of not having enough to eat." And that was true. Three factors combined to save us in our hour of need. The first came from Fritz Haber and Carl Bosch, who invented an inorganic nitrogen fertilizer with a process that used steam, methane and air. At the same time, the era of fossil fuels had arrived and tractors were starting to replace the use of draft animals. And that was a big deal, because if you used animals to pull ploughs and do other farm work, you had to devote up to a third of your land to producing the feed for the animals. The move to tractors not only matched and eventually surpassed the amount of work that could be done by horses, but it also freed up a third of land for human food crops. Also, the fossil fuel transport gradually meant that more and more of the agricultural land in the United States became accessible. So, for instance, in 1920, over 3 million acres of good land in the US Midwest was uncultivated because it was too far away from any train line. That began to change as more rail tracks were laid. But the third factor came from experimenting with different varieties of grain. You should be aware that the crops we eat today look almost nothing like the wild originals that are their ancestors. In 1920, Sir Charles Saunders experimented with plant breeding in an experimental farm in Ottawa. At that point, wheat wasn't very productive in Canada. Red Fife was the most popular variety, and it often didn't mature before the first prairie frosts arrived. From hundreds of test plots, he selected a line that became the variety Marquis. It yielded significantly higher than Red Fife, and it was up to 10 days earlier to ripen, so much better suited to the conditions, and it had good bread baking characteristics. The crop became the most successful introduction of its time. By 1920, 90% of the spring wheat in Canada was Marquis and 70% of that in the USA. So with fertilizers, tractors and more productive varieties. Within a decade of having been staring into the abyss, the supply of wheat surged well in excess of demand. Prices came tumbling down. You even had wheatland being turned over to pasture in Europe because it was no longer required. And so the world was fed. As the Industrial Revolution did its thing, we saw the wealth and inventiveness of the human race spiralling ever upwards, and as we know, the population doing likewise. Suddenly, we passed a milestone of 1 billion people in the world, and then 2, and then 3, and then on to 4. The growth was exponential. And so once again, we saw more modern-day Malthusians rising to the fore. The most famous of these was Paul Ehrlich, who looked to the rising problems, particularly in India, and published a book called The Population Bomb. And he wrote this: "In the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate." He predicted that human numbers would fall to 2 billion and the world would see massive increases in poverty. In the early 1970s, the message was reinforced by a computer model called World 3, which was used to calculate the carrying capacity of the planet's resources. It resulted in the famous report Limits to Growth, published by the so-called Club of Rome. It said that world supplies of zinc, gold, tin, copper, oil and natural gas would all be exhausted by 1992, and there would be a collapse of civilization and population in the following century. Lester Brown predicted in 1974 that we'd hit a turning point and farmers would be unable to keep up with the demand for food. So here we were again, staring into the abyss. And it wasn't an unreasonable prediction. Human numbers were heading skywards in a way that the planet had never seen. But, once again, they were wrong. How did it happen that time? How did we feed the world? India had certainly been on the brink of a major famine. In the mid-1960s, crops were being devastated by drought. People were starving in growing numbers. There was a huge population explosion with over 400 million people barely surviving. The Indian government charged its state monopoly organisations with solving the problem. But here's the thing, state monopolies turned out not to be very effective at solving problems. 5 million tonnes of food aid came from the United States and elsewhere. Without that, things would have been catastrophic. There was an answer, but it needed to be uncovered. There was a Japanese variety of wheat called Norin 10, which was a lot shorter than the standard varieties thanks to a mutation in a gene called RHT1. One of the problems with standard tall varieties of wheat was that if you increased their yield through the use of fertilizers, then they would topple over, they wouldn't be able to stand up. The shorter varieties were better able to resist that. In 1952, Norman Borlaug visited the scientist who was working with that variety and took some of the seeds back with him to Mexico and began trying out crossing it with some other varieties. Within a few years, Borlaug produced a wheat that gave 3 times the yield. By 1963, 95% of Mexico's wheat was Borlaug's variety, and that pushed Mexico's wheat harvest up to 6 times what it had been. It was obviously going to be an important part of the answer for India and for Pakistan. You'd think everyone would embrace it with open arms. Yeah, well, not so much. Between 1963 and 1966, various people did their best to sabotage Borlaug's attempts to bring it to India. Jealous local researchers deliberately under-fertilised the experimental plots. Customs officials in Mexico and America delayed shipments so that they were late for the planting season. Excessive fumigation at customs killed half the seeds. The Indian state grain monopoly lobbied against the seeds, spreading rumours that they were susceptible to disease. Now that sounds familiar. Eventually, Borlaug's persistence overcame all of it. And in 1968, the harvest was a revelation. India went on to issue a postage stamp celebrating the wheat revolution. It was issued in the same year that Paul Ehrlich published his book, The Population Bomb. By 1974, India was exporting wheat. Borlaug had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize back in the days when they were worth having, and we had fed the world once again. It didn't stop all the critics. I mentioned Lester Brown predicted disaster in 1974. Well, he did so again in 1981 and 1984 and 1989. In 1994, he said, "Seldom has the world faced an unfolding emergency whose dimensions are as clear as the growing imbalance between food and people." That statement was followed by a series of bumper harvests. The thing that's worth noting is that none of the breakthroughs were inevitable. If we had systems that were optimized to maximize human ingenuity, maybe you'd say that they were inevitable. But the obstacles that Borlaug faced showed how large institutions, bureaucracies and the like can conspire against the best outcomes based on their own narrow perspectives. It's a lesson worth learning because we're faced with new challenges. Like the original ones, they are real challenges, and we won't prove the Malthusians wrong with complacency. In particular, since the world has become more tightly populated than ever, and our dependence has grown on certain breadbasket areas, our dependence on those areas, where changing climate may make conditions sharply different, has to be taken seriously. Indeed, it has to be taken seriously whether you believe in human-caused climate change as part of that threat or not. The history of climate has shown plenty of instances of natural change with significant consequences. Luckily, science has progressed to the point where our ability to change and adapt has never been so great. We're already producing genetically modified crops that would be better adapted to surviving hotter and drier conditions, should they have to. We're well aware that one of the main constraints will turn out to be fresh water. India has better crops, but it's currently overseeing diminishing aquifers. But again, we're getting better with techniques such as drip irrigation, making use of water many times more efficiently. The question is going to remain whether we can overcome the human obstacles, more so than any of the natural ones. The EU, for instance, remains set against the use of genetically modified crops, even though there's now a history of their use that should be able to show and demonstrate a track record of safety. And a number of the environmental campaigners have been very effective at persuading African governments, where the crops would be most directly beneficial, that they are not to be accepted. Indeed, one pressure group even told the Zambian government that GM crops might cause retroviral infections. As I've said before, if your campaign can't be supported sufficiently by telling the truth, then it's just possible you're on the wrong side.
Are we the baddies?
It doesn't mean that there aren't potential issues with new technologies and they don't have to prove themselves rigorously. But the history of how we fed the world is rife with pessimism that things can be done which are then shown to be wrong by standard processes, that the harbingers of doom dismissed as being inadequate at best and harmful at worst. Now we have people arguing that intensive farming is bad and organic farming is good. And well, maybe, but right now, intensive farming is the only reason why we are able to feed the population of the planet, while still having some rainforests left. If you switched all of that to organic production, it's been calculated it would require an extra area the size of South America, minus, I think, Chile. So if we're going to continue to feed the world, with the challenges that we face ahead, we're going to have to be pragmatic about what the problems are. We have to abandon ideological positions that resist some of the obvious solutions on grounds that don't quite hold up to scrutiny. And we're going to have to keep looking for the new elements that increase efficiency, reduce unintended consequences, and satisfy the preferred food choices of the world's population, unless that genuinely isn't possible. I doubt I need to point it out, but that's not entirely the spirit in which the debate is currently being conducted.